Okay, in this video, we're going to talk about how to build your thesis and create your outline. This is the framework for your essay. And whereas a lot of students don't take this very seriously, that's a shame because the framework, if the framework is flawed, the essay will be flawed. If the framework is good and you follow the framework, then the essay itself should be acceptable at the very least, if not wonderful. So the first thing you have to remember as you're doing this is that when you are writing, thinking informs your writing and writing focuses your thinking. When you begin an essay, you cannot write anything more than a glib passage or word salad, as I might say. If you haven't really thought through your topic, you need to really think about what it is you want to say. But as you begin writing, you may find that what you thought, you didn't really think at all. In other words, you may find that reasons that you thought you wanted to support could not be supported because you couldn't find the evidence to support them. Or perhaps the reasons that you provided take you in new directions. So an outline is a good way to kind of go through that process, and it's really only a few sentences long, but that helps you plan or put the puzzle pieces of evidence together. Before you begin this process, you need to go back by taking stock with what you know. Revisit your review of the literature and review key primary and secondary sources in light of your values. So you've already talked about your values and you've thought about what you think is important in a prison sentence, why a judge would give a prison sentence to someone, to anyone. Keeping that in mind, now go back and revisit what you know about the Brock-Turner case and begin looking for evidence that either supports that these values were upheld or shows that they were not upheld. You cannot write a good essay if you don't know very much about your subject, and you cannot write this essay from Wikipedia alone. So you need to go back and revisit the articles that you used earlier in the semester. Now, once you have done that and you've really thought about it, now determine your conclusion. Keep in mind that your conclusion has to directly address the given or chosen issue. And to make sure you do that, then you should write your conclusion using the precise language of the issue. Sometimes if you change the language of the issue, you change the issue, and then you don't realize what you've done until you've really committed yourself to writing a paper that's totally irrelevant. And then finally, keep in mind that the conclusion alone can serve as your thesis statement. You can just give your conclusion as your thesis and move on. It's not your best thesis statement, but it is a thesis statement. It is rudimentary. It is the bare bones thesis. Once you have determined your conclusion, now begin brainstorming your reasons, and you need to identify reasons that support your conclusion. Your reasons are going to need to be written in complete sentences, and they have to be supportable. In other words, you have to be able to find credible, relevant evidence that supports your reasoning. And we've talked about that throughout the modules. So just because someone expresses an opinion doesn't mean that it's credible or relevant. You need to find information that you can explain that supports the reason. Keep in mind that your reasons have to be reasonable. They're not going to be based on fallacies. They're not going to be based on misinformation or disinformation. They're not going to be based on flawed assumptions. They're not going to be based on omitted information. Reasons must be logical and must be reasonable. And also keep in mind that although 3 reasons are standard, there is no set number of reasons required. It is quite, if you can do your word limit in 2 reasons, then that would be fine. Oftentimes people want 4 or 5 reasons if they feel very strongly about it, and once again they can keep their argument within word limit. it depends on the amount of evidence that you have to use. But if you are using your reasons, keep in mind that you don't want to use 3 reasons and use the same piece of evidence for all 3. So the evidence that you have to use different evidence for different reasons. After you have created your reasons and you've brainstormed those, now you want to think about your opposition. Think about what someone who is opposed to you might say. And what that is going to require you to do is to look at the values that you did not select, that your opposition might select. In other words, if I'm saying that Brock Turner's sentence was appropriate, I might select the value that although the sentence does not make a public statement that we find sexual assault abhorrent, comma, the sentence was appropriate because it did X, Y, and Z. Now keep in mind, if you're going to think about your opposition, you're going to have to provide the counter argument or the refutation. I would argue that the statement, or I could argue, I guess, that the sentence did not make a statement is wrong, because what it did, the sentence included sex offender registration, which is one of the most punitive sentences that we give anybody, anytime, any place. So I could refute that if I chose to put that into my argument. Don't include your opposition if you cannot provide a counter argument. And this means that you need to understand the concept of the Pied pattern. Although refutation makes a stronger argument, it's not required for a good one. In other words, if you can make your case and refute your opponent, you have your strongest argument. But it is not weak if you give your opponent's argument and cannot tell me what's wrong with it, or you waffle, or you bounce back and forth, or you don't even really understand what your opponent is saying. Keep in mind that refutation is optional. It does not need to be included in the argument. If you're going to deal with the opposition, it's going to have to be signaled in your thesis, and it's going to have to be reflected in your outline. In the thesis, you will include the point that you're going to refute. In the outline, you'll provide your exception so that we know that you have a reasonable exception to that point before you move on. Now you're ready to create an outline. And you're going to begin by creating a scratch outline. Now, once again, outlines are very useful. They're graphic organizers. And the first thing you need to know is that they show the order of the pieces of information. So the order that the paragraphs appear in the outline should be the exact order that they appear in the essay. And sometimes I might recommend that you switch Roman numerals around, just because I think it would be more coherent if you addressed your paragraphs in a different order. That's easily done in an outline. It's not easily done when the paper is already written. It also shows the relative importance and the relationship between the different parts. And the outline is a sophisticated method of taking notes. It also provides a really good piece of information or structure if you were to write an abstract. An abstract is a summary of the argument that you intend to present. I don't have you do one, but if I were to do that, you would use your outline for that. So now we begin by writing the thesis statement. Okay, it's important to remember that you don't write a thesis, you build a thesis. If you try to write the thesis, you're going to inevitably get confused. So what we do is we build it, and we start from the middle. So get your piece of paper and sit down, because you can go through the steps as I walk you through them. The first thing that you want to do is to write your conclusion. So my conclusion for this thesis is going to be Judge Aaron Persky did not give Brock Turner an appropriate sentence. Okay, so this is the this is different than the one I showed you before, and this is my conclusion, and it uses the language of the original issue. And keep in mind that this by itself can be a thesis. If this is the only thing you put at the end of your introduction, then you have a thesis statement. It's not your best thesis, but it is a thesis. Now, the next thing you want to do is to blueprint your reasons. So what you would do then is to include a because statement, and then as briefly as possible indicate what the reasons are. Don't put them in complete sentences because that's going to be awkward and so forth. You want to give them in phrases, but you want to give an indication of what your reasons are going to be in the order that they will appear in the paper. So I wrote, because the sentence did not provide retribution or send a message to society that we won't accept rape. Okay, now I'm thinking I want to do refutation. So now at the very end, at the very beginning, what I'm going to do is add my refutation or my acknowledgement of the opposition. And I'm going to start with the phrase even though, or I could start with although. So it's an even though clause or an although clause. Even though people believe that the rehabilitation of Turner was more important than the suffering of Chanel Miller, Judge Aaron Persky did not give Brock Turner an appropriate sentence. Now, I have my conclusion, I have my blueprint of reasons, and I have my although or my even though statement. And now I am ready to go into my outline. Okay, so I have my thesis. Now I'm going to write my outline. Notice that I've got it color-coded here, so we're going to start with our opposition. And I know that sounds a little odd, but we always want to start with our counter argument rather than end with it, because people remember what they read last. And you don't want to end with the opposing viewpoint, especially if you don't handle it very well. So let's get it out of the way. So notice that it says, believe that rehabilitation was more important. Here, what I have to do is I have to give the exception, because the exception is really the point of the pi-ed paragraph. This is the first sentence, obviously, of that paragraph, but this is what you're really trying to prove. And the exception is that rehabilitation of sex offenders rarely works. So what I would start with is I would start with this sentence in that paragraph. I would give an illustration, and I would say this is true, but rehabilitation of sex offenders rarely works, so it shouldn't be a priority, and then I would defend that. The second one, I would say the sentence did not provide retribution needed by Miller and society. And then the last one, the sentence did not make a public statement that we as society abhor rape. Now, keep in mind that they're following the order here. And this is a pi-ed paragraph, and these will be two C paragraphs. Now, I do want you to be very careful, however, because this is not a provable outline. Let me go back and take a look at it. First of all, I've done significant research on this, and I've read most of the articles you're going to deal with. The idea of sex offender rehabilitation programs do work if they are mandated and they are completed. You're not going to be able to find credible evidence that supports this. So whereas this might make sense, when you get to try to defend this, you're not going to be able to do that. That's going to be misinformation. Secondly, these two items right through here, this I think could be argued either way, and this shows, both of these show that Miller needs retribution. That's not evidence that's provable. As a matter of fact, read her statement in the probation officer's report. What she needed was an apology. She didn't necessarily need him to be imprisoned forever. The fact that she was disappointed with the length of the sentence doesn't mean that she didn't get the retribution she needed. So if I were looking at this particular outline, I would be